Star Trek uses the fact that we care so much to, quite frankly, hurt us from time to time, whether that's by watching something beloved fade away before our eyes, or some other way of installing trauma in each and every one of us. Do I sound worried? I should, and so should you be. I'm Sean Ferrick for Trek Culture, and here are 10 Star Trek moments that broke our hearts. Number 10. Farewell, old friend. Star Trek III: The Search for Spock could have easily been a silly film. The most famous Vulcan in cinema history had been consigned to the Genesis planet, while the remaining crew felt truly alive for the first time in years. Despite Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan's bittersweet notes, it was a perfect ending to an outstanding story. So, naturally, let's name the next film as a big spoiler. Yet, Star Trek III ended up becoming something more than people may have expected. It deals with the ramifications of scientific hubris, a disregard for discipline, and the ultimate cost of expansion in the name of impatience. Though, spoiler, Spock is indeed found, it comes at a great cost. What's worse, Admiral James T. Kirk suffers most of all, losing two of the most important things in his life. While we'll discuss the second in a short while, it is arguably the greatest loss to both Kirk and the audience that takes this spot. The Enterprise is older than Kirk. The Enterprise was there from Gene Roddenberry's early drafts, serving as the base for the Cage in 1964, then returning in Where No Man Has Gone Before. It appeared in every episode of the original series, was slated for return in Star Trek Phase 2, and, after heavy refit, made its glorious big screen debut in the motion picture. For Trekkies, the Enterprise is every bit as important as anyone else, so watching the countdown to destruction, knowing that it was a sad case of being outgunned and outmaneuvered, it was truly heartbreaking to watch the explosion tear it apart. For me, the dissolution of her registry hits the hardest, watching the flames rip along the interior of the saucer section, burning away the missions and the memories. This one was a wrench. Number 9. The sad, slow death of Spock's love. For years, Amok Time painted a cold image of T'Pring, Spock's once betrothed. She was seen in this episode as manipulative, although even then, she was not a completely one-dimensional character. She simply loved another, having been repeatedly left behind by Spock. As the original series was airing, it was hard to feel too much sympathy for her, particularly when Spock was our main character, and she nominated Kirk for a fight to the death. Star Trek Strange New Worlds has changed the script on this relationship. Gia Santu's portrayal of T'Pring offers a depth and wealth of emotions to the character that were somewhat lacking in the past. To be entirely fair to Arlene Martell, who originated the role, she only had one episode with barely any scenes to play the part. Sandhu has had the opportunity to explore the role over several episodes, and to be frank, Spock isn't looking the best at this point. What once had been a case of Spock having to deal with his betrothed jilting him has now been reframed. Now T'Pring was ever the faithful partner, patient to a fault, though unafraid to air her frustrations at Spock's continued career choices that kept him away from her. Adding to this is Strange New Worlds exploring the relationship between Spock and Christine Chapel. This, while unconsummated before the pause in Spock and T'Pring's relationship, loomed heavy between them both. He quite clearly chose Chapel over T'Pring, and Vulcan or not, Santu managed to show T'Pring's pain etched in every line. To bring this full circle, Amok Time is now a very different episode. Gone is the depiction of a cold, distant T'Pring doing her best to make Spock's life difficult. Here is a woman who waited, who was neglected, and ultimately forgotten, solidifying her position on Vulcan with Stonn. Theirs was a tragedy, though thankfully not Shakespearean. Number 8. Data's demise and Data's death. For this entry, we're combining two separate moments from Data's life, though they both share the same theme. In both these moments, Data dies. Star Trek Nemesis may have rushed to the ending, but those few moments aboard the Scimitar are crucial. Data beams in, looks his captain in the eye, and slaps the personal transporter on Jean-Luc's shoulder. Before the latter can truly react, he's beamed away, leaving Data alone beside the Thalaron generator. He takes an android-sized breath, points his phaser, and fires. The resulting explosion destroys the Scimitar, all of the Remans aboard, and Data himself, vaporizing the lot, shocking the audience. It's a brutal scene, with the added knowledge that, in 2002, this was the final voyage for the crew of the Enterprise E. It was a downbeat and somber ending to this story, even if it felt a little too quick. 20 years later, hearts would break again, though perhaps more softly this time. In Star Trek Picard's first trailer, audiences were a little surprised to see Data playing poker with his old captain. How? When? Why? It quickly became apparent that this Data was a dream. Oh well, still nice to see Spiner back in the facepaint. But then, A in Arcadia Ego Part 2 brought back the man-bot himself, Data. The very same Data that had flown with Picard for all of those years, reconstructed, digitally at least, by Soong and Maddox, sat before a dead Picard, sending the latter back to life. His only request? Let him die now, in peace, knowing that his purpose has been fulfilled. The first season of Picard has its ups and downs, but this was a moment that rose above most of the others. The acting between Patrick Stewart and Brent Spiner reminded the audience why they truly cared about these characters as much as they did. It felt as though no time at all had passed, and this was simply the next scene in that final film. Though the third season would change the game again, this was truly heartbreaking, even if those broken hearts were accompanied by very watery smiles. Number 7. I Do See You. Commander Ro Laren's story is one of anger, tenacity, redemption, retribution, and ultimately honor. Her rise from ensign, responsible for the deaths of several crew members on an away mission, to earning back her commission and the respect of Captain Picard is now legendary. So too is the betrayal that he felt when she chose to side with the Maquis, leaving Starfleet and taking the fight to the Cardassians, which itself could have been a candidate for this list. However, time has given new context to that decision. The Bajoran people struggled against Cardassian occupation for 50 years, much of which was explored in Deep Space Nine. There is an alternate universe that would have seen Ro serving aboard the station, though Colonel Kira offered enough Bajoran history through her own story. This retroactively made Ro's decision far easier to understand, while it dulled Picard's decision a little bit. Still, audiences clamoured for that reunion, one that we finally received thanks to Star Trek Picard's third season episode, Imposters. Here, we learned that Ro had left the Maquis before they had been destroyed by the Dominion. She had been arrested and served her sentence in a Federation penal colony before being recruited to Starfleet intelligence. She achieved the rank of commander, and it was in this capacity that she boarded the Titan A, facing off against her former commanding officer. Though Captain Riker attempted to keep things amiable, this was all about Ro and Picard. While their scenes may have been all too brief, they certainly satisfied. The understanding that passed between them on the holodeck was everything that we wanted. This was no changeling ruse. This was two old colleagues and, at one time, friends, even with the bitterness that had grown between them. The present threat marshaled and forced their hands, grabbing onto our hearts. I just wanted you to see me, Ro chokes to Picard before she leaves on the shuttle. Ro, I do see you, a clearly devastated Picard cries, knowing this will be the last chance he will get to say it. While no body, no death is beating a drum in my head, the odds are that this will be the last time we get to see Commander Ro Laren. If that is the case, then Ro and Picard have a new, utterly heartbreaking final scene together. Number 6. Sisko's Irish Wake. Tears of the Prophets is often, rightly, added to lists of the saddest or most devastating episodes of Star Trek. Jadzia Dax was easily one of the most likable characters in the franchise. She was exciting, funny, adventurous, humble, and smart. None of this saved her when Dukat beamed into that temple and ruined everyone's day. The episode shows her death most brutally, and certainly one that was starker than Trek had ventured toward. The immediate aftermath was just as stark, even if some of it remained off-screen. Julian's desperate attempts to save her are consigned to our imaginations, as all that we see is his crushed, defeated face as he announces that there was nothing he could do for Jadzia. Sisko walks straight through to the operating room, finding Worf crouched beside his dying wife. While Worf's exchange with her and his anguished warning to the warriors of Sto-vo-kor that she was coming would be enough to earn a spot here, it is the following scene that pips it to the post. As Jadzia's coffin lies in wait for her funeral service to begin, Sisko stands alongside it, trying to find the right words to convey his loss. Worf lost his wife, but Sisko's is a very different tragedy. He has now lost two of the closest friends he ever had, Curzon and Jadzia. Watching this pillar of Starfleet, of the station, and of Bajoran spirituality admit that he doesn't know what to do, and that he has finally to turn his back on his duties, was more than many could bear. He is begging his friend for her help and her advice, even though he knows better than any that she can't answer him. In a quick succession of scenes, Worf screams, Sisko doubts, and then the emissary leaves his post by the Celestial Temple, with no guarantee that he'll ever be back. It was one of the most downbeat endings to a season of Star Trek that had ever been offered, with scenes that still haunt to this day. Number 5. He knows, Doctor. He knows. Edith Keeler must die. Yes, that's a harsh way to begin this entry, but her fate was always sealed. It was the avoidance of this fate that spelled doom for Starfleet and the Federation. Her pacifism saw the delay of the United States' entry into the Second World War, thus allowing the Axis forces to prevail. Dr. McCoy, in his constant attempts to save human life, ended up creating a dark version of reality, all because of his heart. For McCoy, though, the pain that he would surely have felt at the knowledge that he had undone the birth of the Federation was spared.
Kirk and Spock travelled via the Guardian of Forever to a point slightly further back in time,
and were able to set things right. By setting things right, they were forced to involve themselves in the events of the time. Though cliched for sure, this included Kirk's falling in love with Keeler. Perhaps a betting man could have called it, but it is how things are handled that lands on a spot here. The version of The City on the Edge of Forever that made it to the screens may be vastly different from Harlan Ellison's original script, though the devastating ending has never lost its true impact. The elation that Kirk, Spock and McCoy share for the briefest of moments only makes the blade of Keeler's death all the more piercing, particularly as Kirk has to hold McCoy back from saving her. The Doctor doesn't understand why Kirk has done what he has, so we as an audience watch his face fall from joy to panic to horror, all in mere moments. It is Spock who must assure him that Kirk is well aware of what he had to do, for the latter is too broken to say anything at that moment. This episode remains as powerful today for many reasons, not least of which being the brilliant use of tragedy in time travel. Kirk could never have stayed with her. He simply didn't realise how directly involved in her death that he would become. With bruises running deeper than ever before, he leaves the planet, and Star Trek was changed. Number 4. You Klingon bastard, you killed my son. For devastation, Star Trek II is rightly lauded. But for Kirk, there has scarcely been a worse period than those last few days of the USS Enterprise. Though we have already discussed the loss of the ship earlier in this list, which we may agree is a pain that the entire crew may share, Kirk's loss is doubled when he arrives at the Genesis planet. There, he finds a Klingon ship waiting, while down on the surface, a rejuvenated Spock, Saavik, and his son David have been captured. The Klingon commander Krug is almost entirely one-dimensional in this film, though Christopher Lloyd lends a fabulously camp performance that raises him above the script. Having said that, hearts turn to hate when Krug orders the death of one of the captured team on the surface. This is one of the heaviest pains behind David's death. He wasn't even chosen, not specifically, to die. He tried to save Saavik, then ended up on the wrong side of a Klingon blade. It's fast, it's brutal, and it's horrific. Merritt Buttrick played the scene perfectly, with the small screen time that he had. There is a shock and pain in his eyes as the blade hits home. Robin Curtis then manages to inject pain into Saavik's otherwise stoic delivery of the news to Kirk, and William Shatner brings it all home. That stumble on the bridge. Admiral Kirk was finally brought down by the callous actions of a man he'd never met and the faces the exact same kind of loss that Carol Marcus had been afraid of. She had never wanted David to go gallivanting across the galaxy with his father, and now here he was, dead, with Kirk floating in space above, broken. Star Trek III may have some tremendously upbeat moments, the theft of the Enterprise, Don't Call Me Tiny, and the reunion on Vulcan, but for all of that, it packs one hell of a wallop. Number 3. Spot! Brent Spiner famously was not a fan of his feline friend in Star Trek. Spot the cat was a constant during The Next Generation, and despite Spiner's personal feelings, it was clear that Data would suffer no harm to the wonderful furry fiend. After all, he is a good cat, a pretty cat. Star Trek Generations saw the destruction of the drive section of the Enterprise D. At the time, it was believed that the damage to the saucer section was too severe to bother with a salvage, so Data and Commander Troy searched the wreckage for survivors, with Troy's tricorder pinging one life sign very faint. Data tore the debris out of their way and discovered Spot, tucked into a barrel, a bit shaken but otherwise none the worse for wear. This led to the immortal scene of Data crying yellow tears, struggling to understand why he was crying, despite being happy. While that alone could secure an entry on this list, it was another surprise appearance by the four-legged feline that truly hit the heartstrings. While battling Lore for control of the new Golem body in Star Trek Picard, Data elected to use tokens from his past as markers for a life well lived. This, he believed, would help Lore understand what it was to be good. Sherlock Holmes' pipe and the small hologram of Tasha Yar. These all failed to stir Lore, and then the purring began. Seeing Spot appear in Data's arms, a moment of frozen time, for this cat was all but identical to the one we knew and loved, was unexpected and heartbreaking. It was a scene of warmth, even as Lore faded away. But, Counselor, we do not understand. We are happy to see Spot, but we are crying. Perhaps our emotion chips are malfunctioning? Number 2. Lore, please. When this list began, did anyone really expect Lore to feature in a single entry, let alone a second? One wouldn't exactly expect to hear his name when thinking of heartbreaking moments, even if he was the one causing them. Still, watching him fade away after his encounter with Spot had a certain cathartic sense to it, but this scene had no such warmth or even satisfaction. Though the most recent set of awards may have passed LeVar Burton over for his performance in this scene, we will not. Lore connected now to the Titan A computer core, begins to aid Vadic and the Changelings. This puts Geordi's 2 daughters in direct harm, and to say that Burton delivers one of his finest performances feels like an understatement. He is utterly raw in his pleads with the evil android, with his words falling on deaf ears. Perhaps it is the knowledge that, were Lore to remain in control, nothing that LaForge could have done would have made any difference, adds to the power of this scene. Though Alandra is standing behind her father, the audience knows that Sydney is currently fighting several of these changeling soldiers, and, at that point at least, losing. LaForge begs Lore to help, or at least to save his girls, and we cannot give Brent Spiner enough praise for this one, as he switches between Lore and Data so deftly is infuriating, but also in this context, terrifying. Another villain may have killed indiscriminately, but here it feels far more personal. Lore wants to hurt Geordi, and, for these few moments at least, he succeeds, while an audience roars for Data to wake up. Number 1, here's to you lads. It would have been both easy and fitting to place The Needs of the Many at the top of this list. We're going to save that one for a future list, as sadly Star Trek will always have options when it comes to heartbreaking moments. One scene that I simply couldn't leave off this first list was those few moments aboard the holodeck of the Enterprise D when a certain old engineer visited the bridge of his ship one last time. Scotty's toast to his fallen shipmates is quite simply the most heartbreaking moment of the franchise. A certain historical context helps here as well. This is a Scotty who believes himself completely alone, out of time, and in the way. The generations continuity issue aside, he believes himself to be the last survivor of the original Enterprise, having travelled to the future in his own technological way. The score is somber and haunting, while the juxtaposition of the original series aesthetic alongside the then modern Next Generation aesthetic is beautifully jarring. Seeing Scotty as we knew him from the movies, sitting on the bridge of the ship that we knew from the series, has its own nostalgia as well, yet we come back to that last toast to fallen comrades. They're all gone, or so he believes. For him, there is only a lonely future to look forward to, and our collective hearts break for the man. James Doohan delivers one of his finest performances in the sequence, offering a scene that is at once haunting, affecting, and of course, heartbreaking. As the man said, here's to you lads. That's everything for our list today, folks. Thank you so much for listening along. You are wonderful. You are awesome. Now, you can follow us over on Twitter at Trek Culture. We're on the various socials. You can catch myself at Sean Ferrick on them as well. Maybe give this article a check over on whatculture.com. I would be muchly obliged. You are awesome and wonderful. As I say, make sure that you live long and prosper. And if you feel like your heart is breaking, take a second, take a breath, look after yourself, and know that with Star Trek, quite frankly, we're all in this together. Thanks a million, folks.